let's go ahead and do the meeting beginning ritual, everyone. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬、一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位点传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
I always find it synchronistic when we begin to discuss the topics with Bill's topics, and then also with what Derek is referring to with regard to oneness, and especially also with what's going on with the meeting beginning, the ritual that Bill started to discuss. And the reason that I find that so intriguing is because it, as I practice the daily ritual, it helps me to recognize the things that I'm missing, and that I would love to have a copy of the presentation from Bill. Master William and Janice and Derek have been very generous in helping me to learn how to perform the ritual on a daily basis. And most of the communication is done orally, so that there isn't an instruction guide that I've been given on how to perform these things. So I'm left to my own devices with respect to my memory and my ability to remember how to perform these things. And I've just been reminded how my memory isn't as acute as I would like for it to be. So perhaps I can entice Derek and Janice to come over and give me an additional lesson, because I think I'm missing a few things. In keeping with that thought, I'm going to launch into our discussion for the week, which is something that I've found very interesting. I'd like to discuss a quote from a gentleman named Ramesh Balsekar, who is a relatively, he's been around. I think he passed away in the 1990s, as I recall, but he's referred to as an Indian sage. And what I typically do is, as I go out in the community, I'm a big fan of going to bookstores, and particularly secondhand bookstores. I like to cruise around and find the Eastern philosophy section and dig around for things that are kind of new to me, or maybe old to me, but at the same time some things that I haven't seen previously. And so I ran across this book, The Wisdom of Balsekar, and I began to read about it. And this gentleman is a proponent of Advaita, which is, and I'll just read essentially the definition of this, which is the teaching of non-duality, which has become best known in the West through the non-dual spiritual teachings of the revered Indian sage Ramana Maharshi. He taught that self-realization, or the realization of the oneness of who we are, is not some distant goal that only few can attain. Well, this seems to work in tandem with what we practice in the Tao, in that, and in the Buddhist traditions, in that we all have an essential unified nature, the Buddha within. And all it needs to be is uncovered, this recognition of who the truth of who we are really is. So I'm going to read a quote out of this, which is, "The absolute presence," noticing the capital A, "is eternally here and now. The absolute presence can never forget itself, and the term remembering is irrelevant. The sun never knows the night, so there is no question as to whether the sun knows the days. As I struck this passage, it reminded me how this harkens back to many of the talks that we've had about yin and yang and this complementary interplay of opposites, which emanates from that one single source, the Tao. And the last time that Derek and Janice were here, we were going over actually the daily ritual with the shrine. And one of the things that Janice taught me when lighting the lamps is to go from the moonlight into the individual lamps that are on the first table of the shrine, which signifies from the one comes the many, and from the many they come back to the one. So this sense of reflection, the reflection of the absolute taking place in us, it strikes me how everything is symbolic, and how, as per Derek's comment regarding the philosophical practice of Taoism versus the religious practice, what a fine line that can actually be. And for myself, I tend to shy away from dogmatic expressions of the religious, because there seems to be, in my sensation, my overall essence, a feeling of when truth is present, and that it doesn't have to be represented by creating a ritual that has to be followed in a precise order. But yet at the same time, those rituals are representations, they're symbols, just as we are representations and symbols of that absolute presence, that unified truth. So if we're reflections of that, these things, these practices that are performed on a daily basis can serve as reminders that we are simply those reflections, that we go back to the one. And that ritualistic practice engenders a mind state which can kind of trip a switch. It takes us out of the illusory nature of our grasping, of our wanting, of our day-to-day need, of our wants and needs, our stuff focus, and brings us back to the realization that the truth, it doesn't really involve being obsessed with the material, but just the simple recognition that the material is a reflection of the absolute. So it's not a denial of that, but it's more of an inclusive philosophy, really integrating all of it and recognizing it for the truth that it is, which yields a perspective. The individual person's contact with, this is again a quote from the book, the individual person's contact with the awareness of the absolute can come about only when the mind is fasting, as it were. Because when the process of conceptualizing ceases, when the mind, whoops, typo, when the mind is quiet, it reflects reality. When the mind, whoop, another quiet, little typo. So interesting that I did it on both minds. Must be a symbol there. So when it reflects reality, the mind is absolutely motionless. It dissolves, and only reality remains. That is why it's necessary to be one with consciousness. When the mind feasts, reality disappears. When the mind fasts, reality enters. And this, to me, emanates back to this idea of moderation, meditation, and the elevation of consciousness. So I think in that one paragraph that struck me, I was reading it. I usually grab these books and I read them in bed until I go to sleep. And as I was reading that when I was drifting off a few nights ago, it really struck me how true that is about when we become sparse, when we become efficient, when we minimize rather than create continual addition, when we simplify, the mind becomes sparse. The mind is in the process of fasting. Then this recognition of the absolute actually dawns. It comes to us. But when we are feasting, so we're obsessed with the stuff, with the things, with the accumulation, then the true reality disappears. So, how do we strike this balance? I think it's through the use of ritual, through the use of practice, that enables us to recognize the truth of these things, of this material reality, so that we don't place such a high emphasis on it. Is it okay to have material stuff? I think it is, unless we become prisoners of the material stuff. So that's the quandary. It's finding this balance, I think, that we're all in the midst of attempting to try to achieve. And this goes back to the Tao. We come from the One. We become this emanation of many forms. But then the recognition that all forms emanate from the same source, and that we go back to the same source. If we look at the impermanence and truth of all things, it dissolves and it goes back from whence it came. There's no other solution in observable nature, in observable reality with the capital R, if we truly look at it. And I think that's where we can gain the wisdom from the sages that have had clarity of mind enough to recognize this truth, and then be generous enough to pass it on in a form as best they can. Because as we discussed previously, the eternal name is the name that cannot be spoken. So it can't be described adequately with words. I'm struggling with it now, just trying to describe these concepts. But we just muddle along as best we can, attempting to achieve something that is inachievable because it doesn't need to be achieved, because it simply is. And when we recognize that, this illusion dissolves and we reveal that true Buddha nature that is all of us, that is the absolute within us all. So with that, I will leave you, and I'm looking forward to hearing Derek's discussion of oneness.
Thank you so much, Ed. Speaking of oneness, I want to remind you of a choreography that you did a long time ago that you have presented along with your students for the Chinese program, describing that choreography. The phrase that was used was 4 characters. 万法归一, 4 characters. The first character, 1, means 10,000. Second character, 法, means dharma, so 10,000 dharmas, the myriad dharmas, manifestations. 归, return. 一, 1. So, you haven't changed. You've always been focused on this central, very important question of spirituality, this practice of the 万法归一, the myriad dharmas, returning to the One.
True.
A couple of interesting thoughts. First of all, this whole idea about the mind feasting, reality goes away. When the mind is fasting, reality enters. To me, that is so fascinating. And it reminds Larry of another thing that he had heard a long time ago, which is that when you're on a full stomach, your head is empty. Mm-hmm. We've all had that experience, I'm sure. After the all-you-can-eat buffet, I can't think of anything. Just gotta lie down.
Yeah.
And the opposite is also true. That is, when the stomach is empty, suddenly your head is quite full and quite operational.
Very true. Very true. Again, symbolic.
Yes. You know, it's an idea that's reflected in our world at different levels. I spoke of intermittent fasting just a while ago, I think, while you were giving the tour, and studies have shown that people go on intermittent fasting, it actually has a very positive effect on their cognitive functions.
Mm-hmm.
When they did it on rats, they had these lab rats that were able to solve the maze far faster than before. So their brain matters actually had increased in size and density. From an evolutionary point of view, it actually also makes sense because when you are on an empty stomach, you kind of know as part of your survival mechanism that you're going to have to be at your sharpest. You're going to have to be on top of your game. Got to bring the A game in order to bag the game so that you can continue to eat and survive.
Very true.
Let's go ahead and do the meeting closing ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，持架深鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架各位点传世一鞠躬，结班一鞠躬。Okay, guys, we are done.